Hi, this is Jordan from Katie, coming to you from the International AIDS Conference, AIDS 2022, here in Montreal. One of the unique things about the International AIDS Conference is how it blends research and activism. It all started here in 1989, when activists stormed the stage to pass the message, "Nothing about us without us." I spoke to Tim McCaskill, one of the activists who participated in this demonstration, to ask him about the role of activism here at the conference and in the HIV response.
I'm Tim McCaskill. I seem to be affiliated with AIDS Action Now at the conference, even though I'm not sure AIDS Action Now actually exists anymore. But I'm a longtime gay dinosaur AIDS activist about town. So we had planned a demonstration outside the conference hall on La Gauchetière in front of the conference. That was the main entrance in those days. And there'd been a couple of speeches, and I was just scheduled to begin the speeches because I was chair of AIDS Action Now, the major Canadian organization. And I heard this ruckus behind me and kind of looked over my shoulder, and the butch, tight t-shirted boys from ACT UP were bursting through the doors. The security consisted of a couple of elderly, elderly men who didn't know what in the world was going on. And so there were about 200, maybe 300 people who were gathered for the demonstration, and we just followed them. And we went up the big escalators and burst into the main conference hall, which was right in front of those first escalators, and took over the stage. This is about maybe 10 or 15 minutes before the conference was scheduled to actually begin. And so the Prime Minister is back in the green room, and I think Kenneth Kaunda was back in the green room, and security is freaking out. The problem was, since ACT UP hadn't really consulted with us, we had no plan. Nobody knew what was going to happen. So we were there on the stage thinking like, okay, so what's next? And then someone sort of stuck the microphone in my face. There was an attempt to turn off the microphone by the conference people, but they were dissuaded from doing that. So I got to open the conference on behalf of people living with AIDS and HIV, and did a little denunciation of the Mulroney government's negligence and ineptitude in terms of the epidemic. The need to be bold and unpredictable, because if anything, these conferences have become predictable. I think it was in Japan, in Yokohama, in what year would that have been? Late 90s anyway. Activism consisted of 5 minutes at the closing ceremony where a bunch of people with signs marched up on the stage, did a little bit of shouting, and then marched down the other side. And at that point I thought to myself, I think activism has just died, right? Because it's now become this kind of choreographed piece of entertainment for people. This wasn't spontaneous. The slogans, of course, were important and things like that, but it almost didn't come from us. It came from the show. So I think to be bold and unpredictable, like the young activists were yesterday in the middle of the opening ceremonies, is important. I think that the importance of networking with other groups, but actually planning with other groups well in advance, figuring out what the issues are, would also be important. We started working on the manifesto in probably January before the conference, because fax machines had to go back and forth, right? So that activism needs to be more than just a kind of a show. It needs to actually have some political thought behind it and clear targets. And both speak a language that delegates and organizers understand, but also push that language into new areas so that we don't just get caught up in NGO speak that nobody outside of who's ever in the room understands. One of the things that really struck me when I went to Cape Town in the early 2000s for one of the intermediate conferences, there was like a huge demonstration of people on the conference site. But they were pulling not from a culture of gay activism, they were pulling from the anti-apartheid struggle. So the kind of the dancing, the singing in the movement, in the demonstration, they were like the anti-apartheid demonstrations that we'd all come to understand through the 80s. So they were pulling it from a very different basis, and those were people too who had not had their needs met, right? Who were still fighting for access to treatment and care and all of those kinds of things, who still had that spark and that anger, and who were still pushing from the outside to try to get in. So it's unclear where the social basis of future activism lies. Certainly there are marginalized communities of all sorts of different sorts, but they do tend to be marginalized. So there's no kind of critical mass as you would find, say, in the gay rights struggle leading into the early AIDS activism, or the anti-apartheid struggle leading into the fights in South Africa around access to treatment. So it tends to be more fragmented in a certain way. So it's unclear. I guess it will depend on the kinds of overarching social conditions that develop in the future. Yeah, I mean, people see these things as sometimes competing issues, right? Oh, now we've got COVID, like how are we going to keep AIDS on the front burner and this kind of stuff? Well, they're not. They're all part of the same mess, right? I mean, climate change is producing this huge social dislocation and generating wars and generating refugees and, you know, food shortages and all of these kinds of things. And those are the social conditions that epidemics spread in. And the flu epidemic that killed so many people in 1918 came at the end of World War I, right? It was because you had exhausted, impoverished, hungry populations with no immunities left, and unable to kind of defend themselves, both kind of in terms of their own immune system, but in terms of socially against this epidemic. And, you know, as things continue to unravel, I think we have to recognize that that an AIDS activist movement needs to be part of a very broad movement for really deep social change, because without that kind of social change, we're all fucked.